They shoved the papers across the table, smirking as if I were some relic ready for the trash heap. My own blood told me I was finished, too old, too slow, too blind to see the future. I stayed silent, but my silence wasn't weakness. It was the moment I marked the beginning of their end. They thought my warning, "This isn't over," was just the bitter muttering of a defeated man. But the truth? That was the last time they ever laughed at me, because I was about to take everything they held dear. The boardroom reeked of polished wood and stale coffee, but all I could smell was betrayal. My eldest son leaned back in his chair, tapping a gold pen against the table like he owned the place. My daughter scrolled on her phone, barely lifting her eyes to acknowledge me. The company, the one I had built from the ground up with sweat and calloused hands, had turned into a stage for their mockery. "You're out of touch." "Dad," my son said, his words cutting sharper than any blade. "It's time you retire before you drag us down with you." His smile wasn't kind. It was cruel, like he'd been waiting for years to finally say those words aloud. My chest tightened, not from age or weakness, but from the deep sting of betrayal. Employees I once called family sat frozen, pretending to read their notes, unwilling to look at me. My daughter finally looked up and said, "Honestly, Dad, it's embarrassing. You don't understand modern business. Step aside before you ruin what we built." We. As if they had endured the endless nights, the unpaid bills, the doubt from everyone who said I'd fail. I opened my mouth but closed it again. Their laughter filled the silence. Every chuckle, every smirk carved itself into my memory. I could have fought back right there, but what would have been the point? They wanted me humiliated, reduced to a figurehead who would fade quietly into the background. I nodded slowly, as though defeated. But inside, a storm began to form. If they thought this was the end, they hadn't seen the beginning. I whispered one line before walking out. "This isn't over." They laughed again, but one day soon, that laughter would die. I walked out of that boardroom with their laughter still echoing in my ears. But before I tell you how I answered their betrayal, I need to ask you something. What would you have done if your own family stripped away everything you worked your whole life to build? Would you have fought back right there in front of them? Or would you have stayed silent, letting them believe they'd won? Tell me in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who's ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or treated like they didn't matter anymore. And if you think I was right to keep my words short and sharp, to walk out with nothing but a promise, hit the like button so I know I'm not standing alone, and don't forget to subscribe. Because the story I'm about to tell you, it's one they'll wish I never lived to share. When I stepped out of that boardroom, their smug laughter still burning in my ears, I didn't head straight home. I walked the streets for hours, replaying every word, every smirk. The city lights blurred into streaks as I thought back on the long road that had brought me here, to the point where my own flesh and blood believed they could take everything from me and laugh in my face. And maybe before I tell you how I answered them, you need to know where it all began. Because my story wasn't built on handouts or luck. It was built on grit, sacrifice, and nights that seemed endless. I was born in a small town where most families worked the land or the local mills. My father worked double shifts in a textile factory. His hands were always rough, scarred from the looms, and his eyes carried a weariness I didn't understand until I grew older. My mother, God bless her, kept us afloat with whatever she could, sewing clothes for neighbors, selling bread, anything to stretch a single dollar into two. We didn't have much, but we had pride. My father used to tell me, "Son, a man's worth isn't measured by what he's given. It's measured by what he builds." Those words burned themselves into me. As a teenager, I worked odd jobs, cleaning up scrap in workshops, hauling crates in warehouses, even fixing bicycles when the pay was scarce. Every coin I earned, I stacked carefully, because I knew I wasn't destined to stay in the shadows of other men's success. I wanted something of my own, something I could carve with my hands and my name. I still remember the night I met my wife. She was serving coffee at a corner cafe, humming softly under her breath, while I sat at a table covered in grease-stained blueprints and scribbled notes. I was sketching out designs for machines I couldn't afford to build, and she leaned over with a curious smile. "You're going to invent something?" she asked. I laughed nervously and told her, "No, I'm going to build something bigger than myself." From that day on, she believed in me even when no one else did. When we married, we didn't even have money for a proper honeymoon. Instead, we rented a small one-room apartment above a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread woke us each morning. That smell to this day reminds me of hope. It was in that tiny room, with barely enough space for a bed and a desk, that the first sparks of the business were born. I started small, repairing machinery for local farmers and shopkeepers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I worked with my hands until they bled, often falling asleep at the desk with tools still in my grip. My wife would drape a blanket over my shoulders and whisper, "One day, this will all be worth it." And little by little, it was. Word spread. Farmers told other farmers, shopkeepers told their cousins. Soon I was hiring one assistant, then two. I bought an old shed on the edge of town and turned it into a workshop. The first real turning point came when a major distributor noticed our repairs. They needed someone dependable, someone who could keep their equipment running on time. Everyone else had failed them, but I delivered. I didn't just fix their machines. I made them better. Efficiency went up, downtime went down, and before long they were handing me contracts I could only dream of. That was the moment my small workshop grew into a real company. Those early years were brutal. I'd rise before dawn, sometimes working 18-hour days, covered in oil and sweat. My children were young then, and I regret how many bedtimes I missed. But when I was there, I told them stories of how one day this company would be theirs to lead, and they would never have to struggle like I did. My wife often warned me not to put too much weight on their shoulders, but I thought I was building a legacy. The company grew year by year, brick by brick. We expanded from repairs to manufacturing, building machines that outperformed competitors. I hired people from the community, men and women who had once been overlooked. To me, they weren't just employees. They were family. I made sure birthdays were celebrated, weddings supported, funerals honored. That loyalty ran deep, and it paid us back tenfold. I remember when we bought our first factory space. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked, and everyone told me it was a money pit. But I saw potential. With the right vision, that factory became the beating heart of our operations. We didn't just build machines. We built trust. Clients knew that if my company signed a contract, I'd deliver, no excuses. Through the years, success changed many things, but not the core of who I was. Or so I thought. The wealth came slowly, then all at once. One year I was scraping to keep the lights on, and the next, we were shipping products overseas. Suddenly, my children grew up surrounded by comforts I had never known. Private schools, cars, vacations. I wanted them to have everything I didn't. But sometimes I wonder if giving them too much blinded them to the struggle that made it all possible. I recall vividly the day we opened our headquarters downtown. It was a tall building, glass shining in the sun, the company logo raised high for all to see. My children stood beside me, smiling for cameras, and I felt a swell of pride. Reporters asked me what it felt like to succeed. I told them, "This is only the beginning," and I meant it. Because in my mind, the future was secured. A legacy to pass on to my family. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. As the company grew, so did their ambition. At first, it was small things. Disagreements over strategies, whispers that maybe I was too old-fashioned. I brushed it off. They were young, eager, and I told myself they just wanted to innovate. But then the whispers grew louder, turning into meetings I wasn't invited to. Decisions made without me. I'll never forget the first time I realized they were no longer looking at me with respect, but with impatience. My son rolled his eyes when I suggested a traditional method we'd relied on for decades. My daughter laughed when I reminded her how fragile client trust could be. They looked at me like I was a relic, not the man who had built the empire they stood on, but an obstacle in their way. And yet I didn't fight it at first. I told myself it was the natural order of things, children taking over from their father. But deep down it hurt. Every dismissive comment, every dad you wouldn't understand, cut deeper than they knew. And when the day came where they openly mocked me in front of the boardroom, I realized this wasn't just transition, It was betrayal. I gave them my sweat, my years, my very life, and they laughed in my face as if I was nothing. That was the wound that burned hotter than fire, and that wound would soon become the weapon I used to strike back. Because if they thought I was done, they didn't know the man who built an empire out of nothing. They had no idea what storm was waiting for them. When I look back now, I realize the seeds of betrayal had been planted years before that boardroom meeting. They didn't sprout overnight. They grew quietly in the cracks of my family, watered by pride, greed, and the illusion that success was theirs by right. And while I was busy fighting to keep the company thriving, I failed to notice the rot spreading beneath my own roof. It started innocently enough, my son insisting we should modernize operations, my daughter pushing for more aggressive expansion into markets I hadn't yet studied. At first I encouraged them. I wanted them to feel ownership, to carry the business forward into a future I might not live to see. But soon their ideas stopped sounding like collaboration and started sounding like dismissal. "Dad, you just don't get it," they would say. The world has moved on. I brushed it aside, telling myself all children clash with their parents when power shifts. But it didn't stop there. I began to hear things from trusted employees, whispers of private meetings, contracts signed without my approval, clients being told I was phasing out and they should deal only with the younger generation. My name, the one etched into the company's logo, was already being erased in conversations I wasn't invited to. I remember one incident like it was yesterday. We had landed a major deal with an international client, one I had spent years cultivating. When the time came to sign, my son intercepted the meeting, telling me he would handle it. Later, I found out he had told the client I was semi-retired, too old to keep pace with modern negotiations. He used my reputation to secure the deal, but made sure none of the credit circled back to me. When I confronted him, he smiled, shrugged, and said, "It's just business, Dad." But it wasn't just business. It was my life's work. My daughter wasn't any better. She had a sharp tongue and an eye for opportunity, but her ambition carried an edge of cruelty I hadn't seen before. She began to surround herself with advisors and consultants, outsiders who had no loyalty to our family, no connection to the sacrifices that built the foundation they stood on. One night I overheard her on the phone saying, "Dad's vision is outdated. If we don't push him out soon, the company will stagnate." That was when I first felt it, the cold weight in my chest that told me I was no longer their father in business. I was a roadblock. I tried to talk to them, to remind them of the early years, the nights we went without so they could have everything. I told them stories of when I'd come home with oil under my nails and hands so sore I could barely lift a spoon, but still sat down to tell them bedtime stories. My words bounced off their ears like stones against steel. They didn't care. In their eyes, I was already obsolete. The real turning point came one evening at home. My wife and I were sitting at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. She held my hand gently and said, "You've given them everything, and they've forgotten what it cost." Her eyes watered, not from anger, but from heartbreak. She had seen the change in them long before I was willing to admit it. "You always thought this company was your gift to them. But maybe it's your curse." Her words cut deep. For days I wrestled with them. A father should want his children to succeed, but what if their success came at the cost of his dignity? What if, by giving them everything, I had taught them nothing of its value? The truth finally hit me when one of my oldest employees, a man named Carl who had been with me since the shed days, pulled me aside. He whispered, "Boss, they're talking about rewriting the company history. Taking your name off the founding documents, the plaques, even the story on our website. They're saying it'll make the brand look younger, fresher." That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the factory floor, listening to the machines hum, the machines I had fought tooth and nail to buy, the machines that carried our company through the darkest storms. I touched the cold steel and thought of every sacrifice that had led here, and now my own children wanted to erase me, as though I never existed. I wasn't just angry. I was devastated. I felt the kind of betrayal that doesn't come from enemies but from the very people you raised, fed, and trusted. But with that devastation came something else, a spark. A whisper that said, if they want me gone, I'll show them what it means to lose. Still, I didn't act right away. I'm not a man who moves recklessly. Revenge, like business, requires patience. I watched, I listened, and I waited. They thought I was broken, defeated. But in reality, I was taking notes, studying their every move, their every weakness. In those months, I spent a lot of time remembering where I came from. The nights I spent under a flickering light bulb, fixing machines until my eyes blurred. The first dollar I ever earned, folded carefully in my wallet as a reminder that I could build from nothing. The clients who trusted me, not because of flashy talk, but because of solid results. These memories weren't just nostalgia, they were fuel. They reminded me of who I was before success softened the people around me. It was during one of these quiet nights of reflection that I stumbled upon an old leather notebook tucked in my desk. Inside were sketches, plans, and contacts I hadn't thought about in years. Names of clients who had once said, "If you ever start something new, call me." A chill ran through me. What if this wasn't the end? What if, instead of fading into silence, I rose again, not as their father in the boardroom, but as their greatest rival? I closed the notebook and felt a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. They had mocked me. They had tried to erase me. But they had also underestimated me. And that was their fatal mistake. The next day, I walked into the office with my head held high. They laughed, of course. My son smirked. My daughter waved me off as though I were an intruder. But I didn't react. Instead, I smiled politely, gathered a few personal things, and walked out. To them, it looked like surrender, but in my heart, I knew it was the first step in a plan that would make them regret every cruel word, every smug laugh, every betrayal. Because if they thought they could take everything from me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I had built an empire once from nothing, and I was about to do it again, not to pass it on this time, but to take everything they thought was theirs. And as I closed the door behind me, I whispered once more, not for them, but for myself. This isn't over. The weeks that followed my quiet exit from the boardroom were some of the darkest of my life. I'd spent decades waking before dawn, my day guided by the rhythm of machines and the demands of clients. Suddenly my calendar was empty. No phone calls, no meetings, no one waiting for my signature on a contract. At first the silence was deafening. I would sit at the kitchen table in the morning, staring at a cup of black coffee that grew cold before I touched it. My wife tried to console me, telling me that maybe it was time to rest, to enjoy the years I had left. But she saw it in my eyes. Rest was not what I needed. I didn't want peace. I wanted justice. But wanting justice and achieving it are two very different things. My children hadn't just taken control of the company. They had fortified themselves within it, surrounding the business with lawyers, advisors, and consultants who made sure my influence was cut off completely. When I tried to speak to old partners, I found doors closing in my face. It was clear my children had gotten ahead of me, telling everyone I was retired, washed up, and irrelevant. My name, once a symbol of reliability and trust, was being smeared quietly under the guise of succession planning. I still remember the sting of visiting an old client, a man I'd known for 30 years, only to be told politely that he was satisfied with the new leadership. His eyes darted away from mine when he said it, and that told me everything. He wasn't satisfied, but he was afraid. My children had already planted the seed that dealing with me was disloyal, even risky. They were rewriting history, one relationship at a time. 50%, he said bluntly over a glass of whiskey. We go in together, we take them down, and we share the spoils. I shook my head immediately. I don't share what I've built. Not with rivals, not with strangers. His eyes narrowed. Then you'll lose. You're outnumbered, underfunded, and running out of time. Think about it, old man. I walked away that night without giving him an answer, but his words haunted me. Could I really do this alone? Or would my pride destroy me? Meanwhile, Carl, my loyal ally from the factory floor, kept me updated on the worsening conditions inside. Employees were leaving in droves, clients were frustrated with delays, and suppliers were growing wary of late payments. My children's arrogance had blinded them to the truth. Their empire was crumbling beneath them, but outwardly, they strutted and smiled, preparing to announce their merger, as if everything was perfect. The tension became unbearable. Every day I waited felt like a gamble, the risk of losing everything growing heavier. I needed to act, but each move carried danger. If I exposed them too early, they'd paint me as a bitter old man sabotaging his own children. If I waited too long, the merger would lock everything in place. And just when I thought I had found the right rhythm, life threw me another curveball. One evening, as I sat reviewing notes in my kitchen, my grandson came to visit. He was barely 20, still in college, and far more innocent than his parents. He sat across from me, fidgeting with his phone before blurting out, "Grandpa, why don't you just let it go? Dad says you're making things worse." His words cut me deeper than any lawsuit, any betrayal. This was the boy I once held on my lap, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I whispered dreams to about carrying the family name into the future. Now, he looked at me like I was the villain. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "Son, one day you'll understand. This isn't about power or money. It's about respect. It's about remembering where you came from. If you forget that, you lose everything." He looked away, shame flickering across his face. "I don't know who to believe anymore," he admitted softly, before leaving me in silence. That night, I realized my children hadn't just betrayed me. They had poisoned the very next generation against me. And that was something I could not forgive. The complications piled higher still. Legal threats arrived in my mailbox weekly, cease and desist letters accusing me of harassment whenever I spoke to a former client, financial audits that seemed designed to drain my savings with endless legal fees. They were trying to box me in, to exhaust me until I simply gave up. But they underestimated one thing. I had been broke before. I had built from nothing before. And if they thought letters and threats could scare me, they had forgotten the man who had fought through poverty and failure to raise an empire from dust. The breaking point came when Carl called late one night, his voice urgent. "Boss, they're celebrating early. They think the merger's in the bag. But I've heard the truth. Their numbers don't add up. If the wrong people see the books, the whole deal could collapse." I sat in silence, gripping the phone tightly. The window was closing. Everything hinged on my next move. Do I reveal their lies now and risk being painted as a traitor? Or do I wait until the merger announcement and tear the rug out from under them in front of the world? It was the kind of decision that could destroy me, or save everything. That night, staring out the window at the city lights, I made my choice. Revenge isn't about striking first. It's about striking last, and hardest. So I waited. I gathered every shred of evidence from Martin. I lined up potential clients, who whispered their readiness to switch the moment my children faltered. I bided my time while Donovan circled like a vulture, waiting for me to bend. And when the day of the merger announcement finally came, I was there. Not as a defeated old man watching from the sidelines, but as the silent storm waiting to strike. Because what my children didn't know was that their greatest obstacle wasn't gone. He was right behind them, holding the very match that would set their paper empire ablaze. And when the flames rose, they would finally understand the truth. You don't laugh at a man who built an empire with his bare hands. Not unless you're ready to watch him take it all back. The morning of the merger announcement was a bright, cloudless day, the kind of day that seemed designed for triumph. Reporters gathered outside the glass tower my children now called headquarters, cameras flashing as cars pulled into the front lot. Banners with the company's logo fluttered proudly in the breeze. To anyone watching, it looked like the dawn of a new era. To me, it looked like the stage being set for their downfall. I didn't walk into that building through the front doors. I wasn't interested in being seen, not yet. Instead, I sat in a quiet cafe across the street, sipping black coffee as I watched the spectacle unfold. My leather notebook lay open on the table, filled with months of planning, names and connections I had carefully rebuilt. Each page was a reminder. This wasn't revenge driven by rage alone. This was strategy. This was war. The first step of my plan had been patience. In business, the impatient man always loses. My children thought they had beaten me because I left quietly, because I didn't fight in the boardroom. They mistook silence for surrender, but silence is the sharpest weapon. It allows you to move unseen, to study every weakness while your enemy grows arrogant. And arrogant they had become. I had spent months meeting with old clients, not as their supplier, but as an old friend. I listened more than I spoke. I asked them questions, reminded them of the early days when I had shown up personally to fix a machine at midnight, or driven across state lines to ensure a shipment arrived on time. Nostalgia is powerful, and I wielded it like a scalpel. Quietly, steadily, I secured verbal promises. If things go south with your children, we'll come back to you. But promises aren't contracts. I needed more. That's where Martin came in, the consultant who had slipped me evidence of their cooked books. He was nervous every time we met, sweat beading on his forehead, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Still, he delivered. Documents, emails, financial statements, proof that the numbers propping up the merger were as hollow as their loyalty. I knew the timing had to be perfect. If I exposed them too soon, they'd spin it as bitterness, paint me as an old man lashing out. If I waited too long, the merger would go through, and even their collapse might not leave me a foothold. No, I had to let them build their tower of lies so high that when I kicked the base out from under them, the fall would be catastrophic. Donovan, the rival businessman who had once demanded 50%, became another reluctant piece of the puzzle. I didn't trust him, but I didn't need to trust him. I needed his reach. He had contacts in the media, in finance, in circles my children hadn't yet poisoned against me. When he leaned back in his leather chair and said, "Are you finally ready to play ball?" I smiled coldly. "I don't share what's mine," I told him. "But if you want to watch them burn, you'll have a front row seat." He laughed, a dark, knowing laugh, and agreed to help without his cut. Of course, nothing came without risk. Donovan wanted blood, and I suspected he'd turn on me the moment it suited him. But I had dealt with sharks all my life. You don't survive decades in business without learning how to swim among predators. Step 2 of my plan was rebuilding quietly, a shadow company. I registered it under a different name, one that carried no connection to my family, no trace of the empire they thought they owned. Using my old contacts and a few loyal employees who had quietly slipped away from the chaos inside, I began signing small contracts. Nothing flashy, nothing that would raise alarms, just steady, reliable business, the kind of foundation I had built the first time around. Carl, my old ally, became my eyes and ears inside their crumbling empire. He told me about late shipments, angry clients, workers quitting mid-shift. "They don't know how to lead, boss," he said one evening over the phone. "They think respect comes with a title. But the people know better. They know what you built." His words weren't just comfort. They were confirmation. Their empire wasn't just cracking. It was already breaking apart. Step 3 was my favorite. Misdirection. While my children celebrated their upcoming merger, while they preened for cameras and bragged in interviews, I was pulling strings behind the scenes. Quietly, I encouraged suppliers to raise questions about delayed payments. I whispered to reporters about irregularities in the company's books. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. By the time the day of the announcement arrived, those seeds had sprouted. Analysts were already speculating online, wondering why the company had been so secretive about its financials. Competitors began circling, sensing weakness. And my children, too arrogant, too blinded by their own pride, didn't notice the vultures overhead. But my plan wasn't complete. Revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making sure the people who wronged you understand exactly why they're losing. They needed to feel what I had felt in that boardroom: humiliation, betrayal, disbelief. And so, I designed the final stage of my setup with precision. I contacted Martin one last time. "Are you ready?" I asked him. His voice trembled, but he said yes. The documents he had given me were already in the hands of Donovan's media contacts. All that remained was timing. The moment my children stood on that stage to announce their glorious merger, the truth would be released to the world. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to be there, not as a spectator but as the shadow they couldn't shake. So, on the morning of the announcement, I put on the same suit I had worn the day we opened our first factory. The suit my wife had mended a dozen times. The one that still carried the faint scent of oil and sweat no matter how many times it was cleaned. I slipped into the crowd of reporters unnoticed, just another face in the sea. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. My son and daughter stood on stage, smiling for cameras, basking in the glow of their supposed triumph. Flashbulbs went off. Applause echoed. My daughter leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, confident. Today marks the beginning of a bold new chapter. I almost smiled, because even as those words left her mouth, the first whispers were already spreading online. Headlines flashing, merger backed by false numbers? Documents leak suggests financial mismanagement. The room began to buzz, phones vibrating, murmurs rising. My children glanced at each other nervously, not yet realizing the storm they had just walked into, and I stood there, calm, silent, invisible in the crowd, watching, waiting, knowing that the setup was complete, and the real show was only moments away, because revenge isn't a single strike. It's a series of moves, each one sharper than the last, and as the cracks in their perfect facade began to show, I knew the next move would be mine. The moment the whispers began, I knew the trap had been sprung. The merger announcement that was supposed to crown my children as industry visionaries was turning sour before their eyes. I stood near the back of the room, arms folded, watching as they tried to maintain composure. Flashbulbs still popped, but the energy in the hall shifted. Reporters checked their phones, exchanged sharp glances, and began whispering questions to one another. My son pressed on with his speech, his smile stiff. This merger is the beginning of a bold new future for our company. His words fell flat against the rising hum of voices. My daughter leaned in close to him, whispering something I couldn't hear, her face paling under the stage lights. What they didn't know was that the leaks weren't stopping. Every 10 minutes, new documents were being released to media outlets, each one exposing deeper cracks in their financial claims. Martin had done his job well, and Donovan's media contacts were relentless. By the time my children reached the Q&A portion of their announcement, half the reporters had stopped taking notes. Instead, they were firing off texts, forwarding documents, and refreshing their feeds for updates. And then came the first question. A woman from a major financial paper stood up, her voice steady but pointed. Can you explain the discrepancy between the revenue figures you reported here and the internal documents leaked this morning? The room went silent. My son's smile faltered. My daughter gripped the edge of the podium. They exchanged a nervous glance, and then my son stammered, We don't comment on unverified leaks. It was the wrong answer. Reporters swarmed like sharks sensing blood. Questions flew from every corner. Are your numbers inflated? Did you falsify reports to secure investor confidence? Were employees ordered to alter books? The cameras zoomed in on their pale, sweating faces. They had walked onto that stage expecting applause. Instead, they were drowning under the weight of their own lies. I left before it ended. I didn't need to see the whole collapse to know it had begun. Outside, reporters streamed from the building, phones glued to their ears, barking headlines into microphones. And there I was, just another face in the crowd, walking away calmly while their empire burned behind me. But the setup wasn't complete. Exposing them was only part of the plan. Now I needed to ensure they couldn't recover. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. The merger talks froze immediately. Their supposed partner, once eager to seal the deal, backed out publicly, citing concerns over transparency. Stockholders panicked. Investors demanded answers. Lawsuits began to loom. Meanwhile, I was already moving on the second prong of my plan, capturing their clients. I reached out quietly to the ones who had whispered their dissatisfaction to me months before. You've seen the headlines, I told them. You know what's happening. Come with me, and I'll give you what I always gave you. Reliability, honesty, results. One by one, they agreed. Contracts were signed under my new company's name, small at first, but growing rapidly. It wasn't just about profit. It was about momentum, about showing that while my children were flailing, I was steady, dependable, everything they had forgotten to be. Carl was instrumental here. He acted as the bridge, quietly steering frustrated employees toward me. "Boss," he told me one evening, "the people inside are desperate. They're tired of the chaos. They'd rather work for you again, even if it means starting over." I opened my doors to them. Technicians, managers, factory workers, people who had once called me family returned, bringing with them loyalty my children could never buy. Within weeks, my shadow company had grown from a whisper in the dark to a rising storm. But complications arose, as they always do. Donovan, my so-called ally, began pressing harder for a share of my success. "You wouldn't be here without me," he said in a phone call that dripped with smugness. "I want 10%. Consider it a finder's fee." The payoff wasn't just in their downfall, but in what came after. Their reputations were ruined. No investor would touch them. No partner would trust them. They had become walking warnings of what happens when arrogance devours humility. Even their so-called friends, the ones who had cheered them on, vanished like smoke in the wind. Meanwhile, I thrived. The factory grew louder with each passing week. Clients lined up. The community rallied around me, proud to see the founder return. My name, the one they had tried to erase, shone brighter than ever. And yet, I never gloated publicly. I didn't give interviews filled with venom. I didn't write statements about betrayal. I simply worked, and the silence of my success was louder than any insult I could have hurled. The most satisfying moment came months later, at an industry conference. I walked into the grand hall where I had once stood beside my children, smiling for cameras. This time, I walked alone, but the applause that greeted me was deafening. Men and women stood, clapping, nodding, whispering my name with respect. And across the room, in a corner near the back, I saw them, my children. Dressed well but diminished, ignored, forgotten. They saw me too, and for a fleeting moment our eyes met. I didn't need to say a word. My presence was enough. Revenge, I realized, is not about screaming in someone's face. It's not about fists or fire or fury. It's about patience. It's about waiting until the very moment your enemies believe they've won, and then showing them how wrong they were. They thought my silence was defeat. They thought my warning was a joke. They thought age had made me weak. But when I took back the company, when I rebuilt from ashes stronger than ever, when I bought their empire for pennies and left them standing in ruin, they finally understood. This wasn't anger. This wasn't bitterness. This was justice, written in contracts, hammered by gavels, sealed in headlines. And as I stood in that conference hall, applause ringing in my ears, I thought back to that day in the boardroom. Their laughter, my whisper, "This isn't over." I was right, it wasn't, and now, it never will be, for them. In the quiet that followed, I often sat alone in the office of the factory I had reclaimed, the hum of the machines drifting through the walls like a lullaby. I didn't feel triumph in the way people expected, no wild joy, no roaring pride. What I felt was peace. I had not only taken back what was mine, I had taught them a lesson they would never forget. My children had believed I was finished, that age had made me irrelevant. But now, whenever they walked past that factory, whenever they heard my name whispered with respect in the industry, they carried the weight of their choices. I didn't need to punish them further. The punishment was already alive in their regret, day after day. They thought my silence was surrender, I remind myself. But silence was just the beginning of their end.